All right, folks, let's go with one more video today. This is going to be dealing with Chapter 4, Civil Liberties. And tonight we're going to focus on the right to bear arms. And tonight we're going to focus on the rights of the accused. Now, this is a little bit different. And I've jumped around a little bit. I'm actually up into pages, after 146 now, as you take a look at the outline. But understand, if you want a really good example of federalism, y'all, I don't know that there is a better example of federalism in these civil liberties than when you start dealing with the right to bear arms. Because, the federal government is going to have certain policies, certainly the Second Amendment, we're going to get to in just a second. But there is an awful lot of freedom for individual states to decide what gun laws they technically want to enforce, which ones they do not want to actually ever even enact at all. A lot of this is going to be dealing with local government, local parties, individual state voters. It just goes on and on. And so understand, New York or California or Maryland, where I am right now, is probably going to have some significantly different laws that deal with guns, the right to bear arms, than in fact maybe more conservative states like, say, for example, Texas or Oklahoma or South Carolina. I've talked to elected officials, and believe it or not, in close elections, oftentimes the right to bear arms is an issue that actually can tip the election into someone's favor or tip it away from them. And I've had folks in North Carolina tell me that when they lost a close state legislative election, all they did on the next election when they ran and challenged the same person was to draw more attention to their gun rights stances. And when they did, they were able to win. And I would venture to say that if you speak to folks in more liberal states, the idea that they might lean more toward gun control would be the very thing that could get them to be pushed over the edge into a victory, a legislative victory in a close election. So it's something to think about. Now, let me show you the two parts of the text on this, and you'll begin to get an idea of why, in fact, there is a little bit of drama dealing with the Second Amendment. And bear with me here just a second as I juggle my screens. But you'll notice up here is the Second Amendment, and this is perfectly divided where that comma is. And I'll just highlight this first part. You'll notice there it says, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. When you read this, and I think I had mentioned to you that some of these amendments were written with the idea of the circumstance that the colonists had been in under Great Britain. And there was a sense that a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, basically the implication here is that the right to bear arms is necessary as part of a well-regulated militia to secure the security of a free state. So this isn't to say that you or I should be able to have a gun or as many guns as we wanted for whatever pursuits it is that we wanted to pursue, as long as they were legal pursuits, of course. But what this is saying is we have a right to bear arms as part of a militia that's actually going to be serving the good of the entire group and not just one individual person, one individual civil liberty, one individual right. Now, that's the first part of this. And if you read it this way, with this idea of the well-regulated militia being the key on this, well, then all of a sudden, this isn't a guarantee to weapons at all, but this is a guarantee of weapons for the furtherance of the group, of the society, of the state. Now, the second part of this is very different. And this is, again, something that is a very plausible interpretation. You're going to notice here it says the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, if you put your emphasis on the second part of this Second Amendment, this is saying that people have basically an absolute right to keep and bear arms, because it says there specifically that this right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, again, if you focus on the militia clause at the beginning, this is you have a right to bear arms in the pursuance of goals of security for the state. If you focus on the second part, shall not be infringed, Well, basically, what we're saying here is that there is an unfettered right to bear arms. Now, there's no longer militias in the country today like we would think that there would have been, years ago. And I think we know, even in some of the more conservative states, that there are limits with, how you can buy a gun and how many you can have and what you can do with it and all of these other things. What I would say to you is the answer is probably somewhere in between. And why we get frustrated on this is, you know, I think we all like the idea of being able to stand up for our security. I think sometimes folks look at the first part of this and they would say, we need to maintain our guns in order to, be able to stand up to our own government, goodness forbid. And in the second part, I think the idea that the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed would suggest that, again, we still have the ability to be able to provide security for ourselves against people that maybe do not lawfully gain guns or, in fact, are using guns for unlawful purposes. The answer is somewhere in between, but this is going to be a fight that's going on for a long time. And, y'all, I had mentioned to you when we were talking about older people, older people vote. And considering that older people vote at such high levels, maybe it's not surprising that when you look at the budget, that Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security and these kinds of programs are the top features of the budget. Well, when you look at the Second Amendment and you look at gun rights, I'm going to tell you what, the folks that are if there is a group that is more organized than the NRA, the National Rifle Association, the interest group, there can't be more than a handful. And they are the kind of folks that will pressure elected officials. They raise a significant amount of money. And in fact, they also vote at very, very high levels. And I'm not saying that old people have a lot of guns when I was talking about old people voting before, but I guess what I'm saying is if you're a group that votes at high levels, then you're going to get an awful lot of the things that in fact you really want from the government. And I think that's what you see with the Second Amendment. I'm not sure if Kitty is thinking that I'm talking to her as I talk to y'all about guns, but she sure does seem to be interested in sitting in on class. I appreciate your indulgence with me with this. Now, let me juggle my screens again and go back. And the second part is actually going to be, oh, yeah, the OCCC police. It's funny, talking about differences between states and whatnot. There are some folks, y'all, that have actually begun to raise the idea that maybe students should be allowed to carry guns on college campuses, or yeah, college campuses, with the idea in mind that if there is this lone shooter, or if there is an active shooter, that in fact they could be in a better position to be able to defend themselves and to defend their classes. Because if you think about it, if you're sitting in a class and somebody walks in, up, 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 up. I mean, it doesn't take much, and you may not even have dialed 911 or campus security by the time that they've, already done some pretty significant damage. Bring this up to you because, when we did our orientation a couple of weeks ago, the OCCC police, they're very impressive. And they say that they've got more active shooter training and they do more active shooter trainings. They may be some of the best prepared for active shooter situations. So there would be some folks that would say, hey, let's arm students. There would be some folks that would say, hey, let's arm faculty. There would be some folks that would say, let's train and be trained, and let's let the folks that are actually, in position, qualified to be able to do this, and that would be the police. Now, at Montgomery College, where I used to teach, it's funny because we have security, but they just got official uniforms maybe about a year or so ago, and they're not armed. It is a kind of a campus security office, but it's not police in any capacity. When we were looking at OCCC's police office, they had an armory, they had evidence rooms, interrogation rooms, all sorts of things. I will say this, I don't know exactly what all the differences are going to be between OCCC and my former Montgomery College here in Maryland. but I do feel a lot more comfortable at OCCC than maybe at Maryland based upon the security that's there. So it's something to kind of think about. I know that it was funny in North Carolina where I taught, and this was outside of Charlotte. They had signs up that said, you may not bring guns onto college campuses. And it was because people would oftentimes be able to go hunting and then go to school. And sometimes, because their hunting trips would run long, they just throw the weapon in the trunk. And technically, if they parked on campus, they had a gun on campus and they could get in a lot of trouble for that. When I came up to Maryland, the signs that they had posted were smoking is not permitted on campuses. And I had to chuckle because if one place is allowing you to smoke and saying keep your guns at home, they have a very different mindset than, in fact, hey, smoking is not allowed on this campus. This is a smoke-free campus. And, I don't know that I've seen necessarily a lot of signs, haven't been at OCCC enough to know what's posted. But I bring this up to you. The idea that North Carolina and Maryland would have different gun views maybe is not that big of a surprise. Now, the rights of the accused, and I'm going to address these with some examples here first, and we'll kind of see how far we can go with this. But when you start getting into this idea of the rights of the accused, there's really multiple amendments, y'all, that we're going to be dealing with. And you'll notice up here, we've got the Fourth, we've got the Fifth, and we've got the Sixth Amendment that we're going to be dealing with. Now, let me say something to you. I don't know if you've ever been accused of a crime. I don't know if you've ever been a victim of a crime, but when you go to court, I think there's a mindset out there that says that our goal is going to be, truth, justice, and the American way, right? I mean, that's the old Superman comic, truth, justice, and the American way. Well, if you go to court, odds are they're not necessarily going to be able to find out the truth, even if they're really thorough about it, because there's so many factors that can really blur that. Okay. And if they can't find the truth, then theoretically, they really may have difficulty finding the justice. Because again, if you don't know what the truth is, you can do a lot of things right, but it doesn't mean that justice is going to be served. So that leads us to this idea of the American way. What is the American way? Well, the idea with the American way is fairness. And the idea is that there will be due process given to people that are on trial, whether it be for their freedom, whether it be for their life, or whether in fact it be for their monetary treasures. Now, I want you to think about this for just a second. If you've ever been the victim of a crime, you would think, or even if you've watched the television, Hollywood dramas, whatever, you would think that if someone is the victim of a crime, that courts should be set up to protect their rights or to recover their rights, depending upon how you want to look at it. It's actually not. It's fairness for the defendant. When the founding fathers set up this court process, they would much rather send many, many guilty people free than to erroneously lock up one innocent man or one innocent woman. So the idea is that fairness is not for the victims of the crimes, but fairness is for people that are the accused of having committed the crimes. And I bring this up. I don't want to criticize fairness, but I think sometimes people get a little bit frustrated because it seems like the fairness may give too many rights to the accused. So kind of keep that thought in mind. The rights of the accused, we're talking about fairness, and fairness is primarily set up for the accused because, again, the mindset of the founders was we'd rather set an awful lot of guilty people free than lock up so much as one innocent man or innocent woman. So you hear that old phrase, you're innocent until proven guilty. Well, if you're guilty until proven innocent, it's kind of like watching football, and I don't mean soccer, but I mean real football. It's funny, you watch the instant replay challenges that they do. Is there enough evidence to overturn a play? Inevitably, somebody during a football game will say, well, the key thing here is that the pass was called complete on the field. So that means that they would have to prove with the evidence, in fact, that the pass wasn't completed. And by the same token, if it was incomplete and you're challenging, well, then you got to show evidence that in fact it was absolutely caught. So depending upon if the burden is on the defendant or if the burden is on the state to prove innocence or guilt, that ultimately is going to have a big impact. Maybe one of the biggest things is that if you're innocent until proven guilty, that presumption gives the defendant a little more quote unquote fairness from the jump. Let me address some of these amendments right quick. And you'll notice up here the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment is going to deal with unreasonable searches and seizures. And this is really a tricky one because you know, police have a very difficult job, and I don't want to say anything, in fact, that's going to be disrespectful of the police as Kitty begins to spring into action here. But, police have got a very difficult job. On the one hand, I think that many police really want to do the right thing in terms of protecting people that have been victims of crimes or catching people that are perpetrators. Now, with that being said, it seems like when police officers make mistakes, y'all, boy, oh boy, does it get media play. And it almost feels like sometimes all police officers are bad, when in fact, probably very, 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 very few really are. Now, with that being said, what is the role here? Well, no unreasonable searches and seizures. Police have got the ability to collect evidence if something is in plain view. If you're driving down the road and they pull you over and you've got an open container in the cup holder, if you've got a dime bag that's over there on the front seat, have you ever noticed how officers will always come up and shine that flashlight, when they pull you over at 11 or 12 o'clock or certainly after dark? Well, they're doing that because they can see what is actually in plain view. And that means that, in fact, they can very well use that evidence. Something else that happens on this is that volunteering of evidence is important too. If you volunteer evidence, well, they can use that against you. And this is even the case if, in fact, they haven't read you your Miranda rights, which we're going to talk about in just a second. Now, what I mean by this is, I don't know if you've ever been at the scene of an accident, but police officers have a way of trying to be everybody's friend. They have a way of trying to be everybody's friend. And I guess what I mean by that is that if you feel like you're talking to a friend, then you're probably going to talk more freely than in fact you would if you felt like you were not talking to a friend. And if you just start talking and you admit technically that you did something wrong, well, at that point, they can now use this against you because they didn't technically ask you if you had done anything wrong, but you volunteered it. I'll say something else on this. Think about it like this too. It's when you see police officers, there's a uniform, there's a badge, there's a degree of formality that's there. Of course, there are weapons that are there that these officers possess too. And it seems like, okay, that's a police officer. I need to do what he or she tells me. Well, oftentimes what officers will do, and if you've ever worked in retail, right? What do they tell you? Don't ask a yes or a no question, because as soon as somebody tells you no, you're kind of done. You ask open-ended questions. Police officers they don't ask yes or no questions. They don't even ask questions. They just say things. So, if you're driving and the officer doesn't have a warrant, but the officer wants to look in your trunk, or look in your glove box or something along these lines that the flashlight can't see that they're shining in. Okay, they can't just reach in there and do it. What they can do, though, is that they'll do something like, so let's see what you got in your trunk. Or maybe they'll do it a little bit more forcefully. So let's see what you've got in your trunk, sir, ma'am, whatever. Okay, if you think about it, if I've got a respect for police, the police are asking, well, they're in their own way asking me with voice inflection, but the way that they're saying it makes me feel like I've got to do it because they haven't told me to do it and they haven't asked me if they can do it, but they've implied that I need to open up that trunk. Well, understand, if I open up that trunk and then they find a dead body in there, they never read me my rights, but technically I volunteered that evidence because I just of my own free will went and opened the trunk. Now, that seems a little sus, right? It does. But technically, you've got to be very, very careful at the scene of these accidents or at the scenes of these crimes. Make sure that if they ask you questions, it's not a crime to say, I don't know, if you don't know. And also make sure to understand, what your rights are, because there are times when you can say no, or you can ask for this warrant, or you can ask for the justification, or all sorts of things. And typically, if you push back a little bit, officers will have a way of backing down a little bit as well. Let me give you a couple of examples of maybe some specific searches, and I want you to think about this just a second. Now, Kitty has moved off, so let me shuffle my seating position here, and let me give you this idea of vomit. There was a guy a number of years ago, and this is going back, y'all, in God, decades. I mean, this is going way back in time. There was a guy who was accused of being a morphine dealer. There was a guy who was accused of being a morphine dealer. And the police, they got a warrant, right? And they went to his house and they knocked on the door. Well, when they knocked on the door, nobody answered, but the door was ajar. So what did they do? They entered into the residence. They announced that they were police. They were, showing their warrant, these kinds of things. They heard a commotion in one of the back rooms of the house. It turned out to be a back bedroom. So again, knocked on that door, went back there, said that they were police. They knew somebody was back there. The door wasn't open. So, of course, they entered. And then as they entered, they saw the man that was back there kind of go over to the nightstand. He grabbed a handful of something, threw it in his mouth, and swallowed it down. Now, they had a warrant to get morphine. What do you think he just did? They did a search, and y'all, they never found any morphine. However, it did look like he had swallowed morphine. So what did they do? They took him to the hospital. They took him to the hospital. They looked at the doctor and they said, Doc, they said, we have got some, what we think is morphine evidence that this man has swallowed. We would like you to pump his stomach so that we can see the contents. And in fact, when the doctor did pump his stomach, he did eventually vomit up the very morphine that was in the warrant. So here's the question. The police decided that they were going to use the evidence because, in fact, they had a warrant to search the house. They saw him swallow this. In fact, they took him and had a medical professional do a legitimate medical procedure. And in fact, to save the evidence, what did they do? They had the stomach pumped and they found the very evidence that they needed. Okay. Well, there's another side of this. Should the police be able to use this evidence? Or did they violate this defendant? You could make an argument that the police basically yanked this guy out of his house, took him to the hospital, made him vomit against his will, and then, in fact, they fished through the very vomit in order to find pills off of the hospital floor. What the hell kind of is this, Russia? I mean, what's going on? So this was the case. Now, again, maybe you live next door to this guy. Maybe you have kids. Maybe, in fact, that getting this drug dealer off the streets is going to be something that's not only going to help you, but it's going to help the entire neighborhood. Okay, I get it. By the same token, though, y'all, if in fact, he didn't swallow morphine, but maybe he just had a handful of M&Ms or Skittles, right? Sure would look embarrassing if the police start pumping people's stomachs for freaking M&Ms. And the other side of this is they took him forcibly out of his house, made him vomit against his will. I mean, is your stomach something that's a little bit different than, say, a warrant to your house or to the trunk of your car? Well, when the Supreme Court took a look at this case, believe it or not, y'all, they ruled that the police were wrong. And this is what they said in this case. They said, and this was Justice Felix Frankfurter. I'm not making up that name. Justice Felix Frankfurter said, "You mean you're going to drag this guy out of his house in the middle of the night and make him vomit against his will, and then you're going to fish through that vomit on the cold tile floor of the hospital, and you're going to use the pills found there as evidence to convict this man? This kind of police behavior shocks my conscience." Now, here's the thing. Can the police take you to the hospital if they fear for your safety? If the police would have taken him to the hospital and said, "Doc, we need you to pump his stomach because we think that so and so has in fact swallowed a lot of pills that in fact could endanger his mental and physical health." Okay, that's different. But remember what these police officers said. The police officer said, "We need to pump his stomach in order to preserve the evidence." And right there, that was thrown out. Funny thing about court cases, y'all, they will give you the thing that you have to do. Of course, they also sometimes will give you the thing that you need to do going forward, which means, it's going to make it easier for the police to do other things, um, in addition to doing things the right way, because now they're going to know specifically what they're not allowed to do. Let me give you another one. There was a young lady who had a boyfriend who was cheating on her. It was a bad relationship, and she killed him. She killed him. She choked him. She dug her nails in really deep. I mean, it was a bad scene. Now, she wasn't I guess, a suspect, but the police did reach out to her and they were like, "Hey, look, we'd like to talk to you. He's been murdered. We're just trying to figure out what could have happened." And they invited this woman down to the police station. Well, she went down to the police station. And when she was there at the police station, guess what? They happened to see, this is my ring finger, by the way. They happened to see a little bit of blood or red that was on her fingernail. See, it really, really is my ring finger. Okay, so this was a ring finger. And they looked at her and they said, "What's that on your finger?" And she very quickly realized that in fact this was blood, and so she stuck her hand in her pocket and began to like rub on this, just so you're trying to rub on this so that in fact the blood would come off. And the police took her hands out of her pockets. They actually took a sample of what this material was that was on her nail, and then they were able to match it to the blood type of the boyfriend. And guess what? She was charged with murder. Now, here's the thing. Um, what what have they not done? Does anything seem sus about this? Well, we haven't heard anything about her rights being read. We haven't heard anything about there being a warrant. There would be some folks that would say the police caught the killer. The person that was killed has family. They deserve justice. Okay, that's fine. There would be others that would say, but you still have to follow the rules. And you can't just go up to people and question. I mean, golly, she may have just had bad fingernail polish. Maybe she just had too much ketchup at lunch. It could have been any number of things besides blood. And there was no warrant, and there was no reading of rights. Well, the Supreme Court took a look at this case. And believe it or not, they actually ruled in favor of the police. Why is that? Number one, when she put her hand in her pocket and was trying to rub that blood off, guess what? She was destroying evidence in front of police officers. And police officers at that point have the ability to act in order to save the evidence. Okay. Number two on this, they invited her down to the police station. She wasn't a suspect. She could have not answered any questions. She could have not come down to the police station. She could have left as soon as they asked her what was on her finger. But she came down to the police station. She volunteered this evidence. And then she technically decided, well, I'm going to destroy this as fast as I can. Hopefully, they're not going to be able to catch this on me. Now, you're probably saying, okay, what's the difference between her with this fingernail and that guy swallowing the morphine? That's a good question. And this is where it gets into the invasiveness of the search. Now, if you think about it, if you've got blood on your ring fingernail, right? You got blood on your ring fingernail. That's on the outside of your body. Somebody from the police department can actually come in. You don't need a doctor to get that evidence. I mean, that would be like collecting breathalyzer evidence or, glass evidence or something at the scene of a crime. You just need somebody that's good at collecting evidence and you're fine. Well, when you start swallowing things, that's not on the exterior of your body, that's invasive to your body. Police officers cannot get a warrant to search your stomach. Now, like I said, if this would be a dangerous situation to the person, okay, they can maybe get that stomach pump then. But if you're just trying to preserve evidence, in fact, they can't do that. So understand the invasiveness of the search, the destruction of the evidence, and the voluntary nature of this made this a very different case than the first one, and she was ultimately convicted. Bottom line, y'all, for our purposes, and we're talking about what's an unreasonable search and seizure. It kind of depends. Here's what I would say, though. Be careful around police officers. I know that anytime I'm around a police officer and something could be misinterpreted or misunderstood, you know what? I'm going to sit quietly for a while and just kind of watch the scene and see what the direction is that they're going. And, you know, I'm going to commit to as little as possible, just with the idea in mind that I don't know exactly what it is that they're looking for, and I don't know exactly how I fit into this investigation. The other thing that I would say to you on this so don't volunteer something, I guess is the bottom line. Don't volunteer things. Now, the other side of this is the exclusionary rule. If police officers actually are able to gain evidence, but they gain evidence illegally, this is actually excluded. Let me give you one more example of this one, and I'll give you something to think about. This case is going back maybe about 25 years, and this is going back to North Carolina, where a guy and a girl went to a work party at Christmas time. Guy and a girl went to a work party. It was at a bar right by the beach. And in fact, they were there. They drank an awful lot, and then they voluntarily left the bar together to walk on the beach. Now, think about your own lives. Okay, when you leave a party with somebody, especially to go take a walk on the beach at night, especially after you've had a few drinks, maybe whether there should be or not is different. Maybe there is a certain expectation that you want a little more intimacy with that person. Well, it turns out that the woman passed out on the beach. The guy actually took out his cell phone and began to take pictures of her. And then he began to undress her and take pictures of her. And in fact, people called the police from payphones. This was 25 years ago, saying, hey, look, there's something going on the beach. You might want to come out here and take a look at this. And when the police got there, because everything that these calls had said matched the two people, they took his cell phone, they went through it, and they found the very pictures that were being described by the people that called it in. He was charged with second-degree sexual assault and secret peeping photographic imaging. Well, here's the thing. They didn't have a warrant. Now, 25 years ago, it wasn't clear if you needed a warrant to go through somebody's phone. So the police, in their haste to try and secure the situation, the police, in their haste to do right by the woman that had passed out, the police, in their haste to do a good job, they actually may have compromised the scene. So this guy sued and said this was an unreasonable search and seizure. Now understand on this, they had pictures, but if this was an unreasonable search and seizure, these pictures are gone. The police used these pictures to get a warrant, and then they were able to get more pictures from, in fact, the guy's cell phone company. Well, if the original pictures were removed because of the exclusionary rule, that means the additional pictures would be removed. Okay, this is not sounding very good. And then the people that called in, they called from a payphone. They were long gone. We don't know who they were. So there were no technical eyewitnesses. The evidence was the pictures. And if the pictures were gone, this guy was going to walk. Guess what? The North Carolina court system, because this was the first time there had ever been a question about whether or not the police needed a warrant to go through somebody's cell phone. They said they did. This evidence was all thrown out, and the guy that had committed secret peeping, photographic imaging, and second-degree sexual assault, guess what? He walked free. Remember what I had said at the beginning. If you're a victim of a crime, y'all, it's not necessarily your rights that the system is focused on, but it's on the rights of the accused. It's on the rights of the defendant. And by all intents and purposes, this guy committed these crimes. There are pictures that said he did it. He sent them out to coworkers. It's what the other warrant that they were able to get, the other pictures that they were able to get from that warrant showed. But when the police gathered the evidence incorrectly, that meant they lost it all. And that meant that they had violated his rights and his due process. And guess what? That meant that he ended up going free. Y'all, I will stop there and come back in just a second. And we will wrap up this civil liberties piece.